I wanted to talk a little bit about corrosion and how that affects metals, and what the different types of corrosion is on different metals. So the main metals that we deal with at Kaiser are steel, carbon steel, aluminum, and stainless steel. So those are the three main categories that we deal with. So regular steel, everybody's pretty familiar with how that corrodes. It's rust, right? So it's the orange rust. That is how steel corrodes. How does that happen? If it's an uncoated part exposed to the elements outside, getting a lot of moisture on it, that's typically when rusting is going to happen. Can rusting happen if an uncoated steel part is inside? Yes, it can, over a long period of time with moisture and just being open to just regular oxygen, because the steel is oxidizing. You're going to get rusting. And it's very noticeable and very detrimental to the substrate. If you leave it like that for a long time, like a metal part outside, eventually it can just rust to nothing. Over a really, really long period of time, it would just rust to nothing. There'd be nothing left of it. That's why, like, railings or things, old railings that had coating fall off and they're really rusty at the bottom, they could start getting holes in the tubing because it's just literally rusting away. There's nothing left of the metal. Aluminum corrodes a little bit differently, and it looks different, right? So when you think about aluminum, most people that are familiar with metals would be like, well, aluminum doesn't rust. And you're right, you don't see the orange looking nasty rust, but aluminum does still corrode, still oxidizes. Normally when aluminum corrodes, it's kind of a white chalky look. Sometimes there could be some dark spots and black, but most of the time it's a white chalky look. We normally see that when you have aluminum pieces that end up with water in between them. So if you have like a stack of aluminum panels and water gets in between them and just gets to sit, then that's normally when we'll start seeing some corrosion on aluminum. If you just have raw aluminum exposed to the elements and it's outside, as like an aluminum door or aluminum window, but it's just raw with no coating, no clear coat, no anodizing, no powder coating, nothing, that will start to kind of have that white chalky, kind of like it has a little bit of frost on it almost. It just has like a kind of like scum and buildup is what it seems like, but it's white and chalky instead of with steel it's orange rust. And that corrosion is just as detrimental to aluminum as like rust is detrimental to steel. So over time it can really break aluminum down. It's pretty rare to see like holes in aluminum from corrosion. It can happen, but normally there's almost like you have to have some sort of acid mixed in that's really eating away at the aluminum for that to happen. I personally haven't seen a case where like an aluminum railing has a hole in it because it corroded so bad being out in the weather. Aluminum resists corrosion quite a bit better than steel, so you usually just don't get to that point. Not saying it can't happen, but it's pretty unlikely. I personally haven't seen it. And then stainless steel. Most people think stainless steel can't corrode, can't rust. And in general, if it's a really good quality stainless steel, you're right. If it doesn't have any iron in it, which you can test that by putting a magnet on it, and then if the magnet doesn't stick, there's no iron, or there's very low iron content, then your stainless steel should not rust. The problem is, and it seems like in the stainless steels that are readily available in the United States, and not the absolute highest purity and the highest price, are starting to have a little bit more iron content. They're not quite as good of quality, just because metals get recycled over time, and so there's the stainless steel is starting to be less pure. Like the easier to get stainless steel is starting to be a little less pure, so that can corrode, can rust, because basically instead of being stainless steel, now you're leaning more towards a steel, right? It still looks like stainless steel, kind of that bright silver white look, But if you expose it to a lot of moisture and outside weathering, you can start to see some rusting. It's usually not near as bad as it would be on just a regular piece of steel. It's not like super orange and it's rusting through and making a hole in the stainless, because it has a pretty low content of iron, because it is still stainless steel. It's just not super pure. So it'll just have a little bit of rusting, but it's probably not going to be detrimental to the structure. But you can't just assume that you don't have to put any coating on stainless steel unless you really know that you got a really good quality stainless steel and you have some sort of technical data sheet that came with the tubing that like certifies that, okay, this is the contents of the stainless steel. Then you can be a lot more confident on what kind of corrosion resistance you're going to have with that stainless. So how does Kaiser deal with that corrosion? Now that you know what it is, how do we deal with that corrosion? Almost always we're going to blast it off. That's the best way to prep that surface, is to blast off the old rust, to blast off the corrosion that's on aluminum, to blast off the corrosion that's on stainless steel. So when we're blasting off rust off of steel, we're going to use our regular steel grit. If it's really rusty, material started to break down, like once you blast away all the rust, sometimes you're pretty surprised with how little steel is left. When a part is really rusty, it looks like the rust is just on the surface and there's a lot of metal left. But once you go and blast that, all the rust flakes off, disintegrates, and you end up with a part that has a lot of dips and dives and really porous and could have holes in it, and you didn't necessarily realize that before it got blasted. So that's an issue, and that has to be addressed before a coating can be applied. For aluminum or stainless steel, we use crushed glass to blast that, to clean up the corrosion, because we don't want to impregnate any steel grit into the aluminum or stainless steel, because those are non-ferrous substrates. We don't want to introduce any ferrous material, which would be the steel grit, because then that could make those parts actually rust worse than they're already rusting. So once we have the surface prep done, we have the corrosion gone, then we're going to go through pre-treatment, just like we talk about normally. Steel is an iron phosphate, aluminum is a zirconium, stainless steel, zirconium, and then we go ahead and powder coat. And so that's basically how we handle corrosion. It's very hard to just pre-treat corrosion away. If you have rusty parts, it's really, really hard to have a pre-treatment process that will remove the rust. It's possible, but when it's really invasive rust and it's really deep and beyond the surface of the metal, it's pretty hard to get rid of unless you blast it off. Same thing with corrosion and oxidation that you're going to see on aluminum. Anytime you get into the deep corrosion where it's actually starting to kind of get into the substrate and remove some material, there's some roughness, there's some texture there, and it's really hard to pre-treat that away so that doesn't telegraph through the coating, so you don't see the transition, you don't see that roughness. Blasting will usually take care of that unless it's really, really deep corrosion, and when it gets to that point, it's almost like you want to go with a new substrate anyway, because the structure of the material isn't going to work anymore because there's too much material that's gone. There are some processes in pre-treatment that can remove rust and can remove some oxidation. It takes specialized chemicals, and it's not chemicals that we have in our arsenal that we could quickly remove that type of corrosion with pre-treatment. So for our case, it's better to blast. There might be other companies out there that don't have the capability of blasting, so they have some more chemicals in their arsenal that will deal with some corrosion on steel and aluminum and stainless steel, that will get into that, clean it up, etch it, peel it off, get it off of there, and then they go ahead and do their normal pre-treatment process. I'm not very familiar with that, but it is possible. The last thing that you need to remember with really invasive corrosion, so a really rusty part or a piece of aluminum that's really has corroded and oxidized a lot, or stainless steel for some reason is really rusty, unlikely but it's possible, is that if you're blasting or pre-treating the corrosion away, in our case at Kaiser we're blasting it away, if you don't pre-treat that part quickly and get a coating on that part to protect that substrate underneath, if it's already been corroding and it's in rusting and it's very, very bad and invasive, even though you've blasted that off and got down to a clean substrate, it in general will start corroding again very quickly. So if you have an extremely rusty part and you blast it one morning, you leave it, you don't have a chance to get it pre-treated, usually the next morning when you come in, it'll have started to rust again. It depends on the climate in the shop, so it depends on the humidity, so that could depend on the time of the year. If it's a drier climate, it's not as big a deal, but if it's a like for us in Nebraska, we're normally pretty humid or have a decent humidity most of the year, so we have to be careful of if we have really rusty railing that comes in that we're blasting off the old paint and all the old rust, and then we're going to pre-treat it and powder coat it. We want to try to line up our schedule so once it's been blasted, try to get it blasted in the morning before lunch one day, and then it's going over to the powder coating shop and it's getting pre-treated that afternoon with iron phosphate to try to protect that substrate the best we can, and then if possible we're going to start powder coating it by the end of the day, if not the next morning, so that way we can get that substrate protected from the elements, protected from the moisture and the air, and so that way it doesn't start corroding again on us and rusting again. Same thing with aluminum. Steel is a little more reactive, so it's a little more important with steel and the rust that happens, because if you've blasted all the rust off and it starts to rust again and you just pre-treat over top of that and powder coat over top of that, you might not see it under there, but it's already started to rust, so it's going to reduce the longevity of the coating, because the substrate underneath has already been rusting. That's going to spread underneath the coating, eventually will cause some bubbles in the coating will peel off, you'll see the rusty substrate underneath.